Across the counter, our waitress froze, her smile cracking as the man beside her leaned in too close again. For a second, her eyes met mine, pleading, searching, and I realized everyone else was looking away. The morning sun spilled generously through the wide front windows of the diner, turning the black and white checkered floor into a mosaic of soft gold. Mark leaned back against the red vinyl of the booth, the kind that squeaked faintly when you shifted, and let the warmth seep across his shoulders. His coffee sat steaming beside him, the aroma sharp but comforting, a reminder that even on mornings when the world felt heavy, there were still rituals that steadied him. Across from him, Sophie was on a mission. At 7 years old, she attacked her pancakes with the seriousness of a surgeon, drenching them in syrup until the plate looked more like a pond than a breakfast dish. She giggled as she tried to cut them herself, the knife clinking and skidding against the plate in a way that made Mark suppress a smile. She wasn't very successful, but she was determined, and he knew better than to intervene too soon. "Daddy, it keeps slipping," she muttered, her brow furrowed as she leaned hard on the knife. "Try holding the fork steady with your other hand," Mark suggested, his voice gentle. He resisted the urge to just take the knife and do it for her. Teaching her, letting her try and stumble, was part of being a dad. Sophie followed his instructions, her tongue peeking out the corner of her mouth in concentration. The next cut was a little cleaner. She looked up at him proudly, her eyes bright, as though she had conquered something enormous. "See? Told you," Mark said, giving her a wink. She giggled again, more freely this time, and shoved the uneven triangle of pancake into her mouth. Syrup dripped down her chin, and she wiped it away with the back of her hand. Mark passed her a napkin wordlessly, shaking his head in mock exasperation. She grinned, knowing full well she had made him smile. These were the moments he lived for, the quiet, ordinary mornings where the world felt simple. No deadlines looming, no bills pressing at the edges of his thoughts, no reminders of everything he carried alone since Sophie's mom left. Just a booth, a plate of pancakes, and his daughter's laughter filling the space. For a man who often felt like life was an uphill climb, these small rituals were the level ground where he could catch his breath. Sophie, between bites, launched into a detailed plan for their weekend. "We can go to the park, Daddy, and maybe fly the kite if the wind's good. And then, oh, we could bake cookies, but only if you promise not to burn them like last time." Mark chuckled, raising his hands in surrender. "One time, Sophie. One time I left them in too long, and suddenly I'm the worst baker in the county." "They were black, Daddy. Black. Even the dog wouldn't eat them," she said through laughter, almost choking on her pancake. He reached across and ruffled her hair, watching her beam at him with sticky cheeks. She was his anchor, reminding him that joy didn't have to be bought, that laughter could survive even the hardest seasons. He sipped his coffee slowly, letting the warmth coat his throat, content to let her chatter fill the space. It was in the middle of that laughter, when Sophie's voice was rising with excitement, that Mark's attention drifted. Out of the corner of his eye, he caught sight of their waitress. She was moving quickly between tables, balancing a tray with practiced ease, her apron slightly askew. She wore a smile, the kind every waitress wore to keep a shift running smoothly. But her eyes told a different story. Mark didn't know why, but something in her expression made him pause, something that didn't belong in the easy rhythm of a breakfast crowd. He blinked, took another sip of coffee, and tried to shake the thought off. Maybe he was imagining it. After all, this was supposed to be their peaceful morning. But the seed of unease had been planted. Mark tried to keep his focus on Sophie's weekend plans, nodding along as she spoke about kites, cookies, and a possible trip to the library. Her voice was animated, her hands flapping for emphasis as syrupy forkfuls punctuated her excitement. But even as he listened, his eyes kept straying back to the waitress. Her name tag read Emily in faded black letters, the edges of the plastic worn from years of use. She moved briskly, weaving between tables with the balance of someone who had done this 1,000 times. Yet, despite the smooth motions, there was tension riding in her shoulders, a stiffness that didn't match the easy smile fixed on her face. Mark followed her gaze and noticed the man at the counter. He was hunched forward on his stool, nursing a mug of coffee that had probably gone cold, leaning in every time Emily passed like he was waiting for an excuse to speak. His voice was too low for Mark to catch, but Emily's reaction told him enough. The first time it happened, she stiffened, her fingers tightening around the coffee pot until her knuckles whitened. She covered it with a quick smile, but Mark had seen that kind of smile before, the kind people used when they wanted to smooth something over to avoid making it worse. Sophie's fork scraped against her plate, pulling Mark back for a moment. "Can we go after breakfast, Daddy? To the park?" she asked eagerly. "Yeah, we can do that," he said, giving her a smile, though his attention was still partly fixed on Emily. When Emily walked past again, the man leaned forward further, murmuring something that made her laugh. But it wasn't the kind of laugh Mark had just shared with his daughter. This one was too sharp, too quick, like a laugh forced through a clenched jaw. Her eyes darted not toward the man but toward the kitchen door, as though measuring how far it would take to slip behind it. Mark felt a tightness in his chest. He'd seen enough job sites, enough men pushing their luck, to recognize when someone wasn't comfortable. There was a difference between banter and pressure, and this was pressure. He looked at Sophie, still talking, her small hands waving in the air as she tried to describe the size of the kite they'd bring. But her father's mind was already split in two, half present with her, half drawn to the quiet storm unraveling across the diner. Emily set a plate down on another table, and Mark noticed her shoulders again. Each time she passed the counter, they crept a fraction higher, like she was trying to make herself smaller. And the man never stopped leaning, never stopped talking, always pushing into her space without moving from his stool. Mark shifted in his seat, unsettled. Maybe he was reading too much into it. Maybe it was just a bad morning. But then Emily's hand brushed the man's as she set down his plate, and she recoiled just slightly. Not enough to make it obvious to the whole diner, but enough that Mark saw it. Enough that his stomach tightened into a knot. Sophie's voice faded in his ears as he tried to convince himself to stay out of it. He was just a customer, a single dad out with his daughter for breakfast. But his instincts, those sharp, parental instincts honed over years of protecting Sophie from everything from playground bullies to careless drivers, were stirring. And those instincts were telling him something wasn't right. Emily moved past again, her voice softer now, almost shaky, the confident rhythm she'd used earlier at their table stripped away. The man at the counter leaned closer still, as though he couldn't get enough of making her retreat one step at a time. Mark glanced back at Sophie, who was licking syrup from her fork and humming a tune under her breath. For her, the world was still safe, bright, filled with pancakes and parks. But for Emily, something was unraveling, and Mark felt the first tug of responsibility pulling at him. He didn't know her, but the way her eyes flicked toward the kitchen door again, almost pleading, told him she wished someone would notice. And Mark had noticed. Mark kept shifting his gaze between Sophie's sticky grin and the counter where Emily moved back and forth. His daughter's chatter anchored him, but every time his eyes drifted back, the picture at the counter grew clearer, darker, harder to ignore. It started small, the kind of details you might miss if you weren't paying attention. But Mark was paying attention. Years of fatherhood had trained his senses to scan for trouble before it struck. And with each passing minute, the signs stacked up like stones on his chest. The first one was simple: distance. Each time the man at the counter leaned toward Emily, she stepped back just slightly. Not a retreat anyone else in the diner would notice, but Mark did. It was the instinctive pull of someone trying to shrink out of reach, the kind of subtle movement people made when they couldn't just walk away. The second came from her eyes. They weren't on the man, not really. They flicked again and again toward the kitchen door. Quick glances, fleeting but desperate, as if she were searching for an escape route, measuring how far she'd have to walk to disappear into safety. The third sign was unmistakable. When she set down his plate, his hand brushed hers. Just a glancing touch, casual enough to look accidental. But she flinched. Not dramatically, but enough that her whole arm stiffened, and her smile faltered for the briefest second. Mark's stomach turned cold at the sight. He glanced down at Sophie, hoping she hadn't noticed, but she had. She was watching. Her fork paused halfway to her mouth, her little brow furrowed. She didn't have the words to name it, but she felt it too. The fourth sign came in her voice. Mark strained to listen, and what he heard was different from before. Earlier, she had spoken with confidence, her tone bright, practiced, even cheerful. Now it was quiet, almost shaky, like someone trying to keep themselves steady while standing on thin ice. And then the fifth, the one that clenched it for him. Emily laughed. But it wasn't laughter, not really. It was brittle, high-pitched, hollow. The kind of sound people used when they were trying to smooth a situation over, to keep it from boiling over. It carried no warmth, no joy, just the brittle edge of someone forcing themselves to pretend. Mark's jaw tightened. His eyes flicked back to Sophie again, and she was staring openly at Emily now. Finally, she tugged at his sleeve, her small hand clutching the fabric like it was urgent. "Daddy," she whispered. Just one word, soft but heavy. Mark turned to her. "Yes, sweetheart." Her voice dropped lower, as if afraid the man at the counter might hear. She looked scared. The words landed like a stone in his chest. He had been hoping he was overthinking it, that maybe Emily was just tired, maybe it was just a bad morning. But hearing Sophie say it, seeing the fear mirrored in his daughter's young eyes, made it impossible to ignore. If a child could see it, then it was real. Mark took a slow sip of coffee, though the warmth no longer comforted him. His mind was racing. He had been in situations before where the safer choice was to keep your head down, pretend not to notice, let someone else step in. But here, there was no one else. The cook was buried in the back. Other customers were bent over their breakfasts, absorbed in their own lives. And Emily had no one. Sophie's small hand was still gripping his sleeve. She wasn't just asking a question now. She was looking at him to see what he would do. Mark's pulse quickened, his heart thudding harder with each passing second. He knew the truth of it. If he stayed silent, if he looked away, what lesson would that teach his daughter? That you ignore someone in trouble. That fear is stronger than kindness. And that wasn't the example he wanted to set. Mark sat rigid in the booth, the red vinyl pressing against his back as if trying to push him forward. The coffee in his mug had gone lukewarm, but he held it anyway, using it as a shield while his mind churned. "Don't cause a scene," a voice in his head warned. "You don't know the full story. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe she's fine." But another voice cut through, sharper and louder. "You've had this talk with Sophie 100 times. About being brave. About doing the right thing, even when it isn't easy. What kind of father are you if you tell her one thing and then do the opposite?" He glanced across the table. Sophie had stopped eating. Her fork rested on her plate, forgotten, syrup pooling underneath it. She was still watching Emily, her young face tense in a way he wasn't used to seeing. Childhood was supposed to be light, full of laughter and pancakes, not heavy with questions about why grown-ups sometimes failed to protect each other. Mark shifted his gaze back to Emily. She moved quickly, but her steps carried strain. Her smile flashed, then dimmed just as fast, her shoulders tightening each time the man leaned forward. She wasn't going to ask for help. That much was clear. People rarely did. But her silence didn't erase her need. Mark's chest tightened. He remembered nights when Sophie was smaller, when she'd wake up crying after a nightmare. How quickly he would leap out of bed, how instinctively he had gone to her, whispering that she was safe, that nothing could hurt her while he was there. That same instinct roared in him now, but it was directed at a woman he didn't even know. He took another sip of coffee, but the bitter taste only fueled his frustration. He could sit here, pretend not to notice, let Emily keep fending for herself. But if he did, Sophie would see it. She'd see that her dad, her protector, her example, had looked away when someone needed help. Sophie tugged at his sleeve again, smaller this time, as if she could sense his hesitation. "Daddy," she whispered, "are you going to help her?" Mark's throat tightened. He set the mug down carefully, his hand trembling just enough that he noticed it. He thought about all the times in his life when silence had been the easier path, when keeping your head down kept you out of trouble, when looking away let you avoid conflict. But he also thought about the cost, the weight of regret, the knowledge that you could have done something and didn't. He looked at Sophie, her wide eyes locked on him. This moment wasn't just about Emily. It was about her, about what kind of father she would remember him to be. He drew in a slow breath. His decision crystallized, heavy but certain. Mark slid his plate aside and pushed himself up from the booth. His heart thudded against his ribs, but his movements were steady. Sophie watched him with a mixture of fear and hope, her small hands folded tight in her lap. As he straightened, he caught Emily's eyes across the diner. She froze for half a second, startled, but then something flickered in her gaze. Relief, as if she had been silently wishing someone would notice, someone would care enough to stand. Mark gave her a small nod, the kind that said, "You're not alone anymore." Then he turned toward the counter, each step carrying the weight of a choice he couldn't take back. The diner's hum dulled as Mark walked toward the counter, each step sounding louder in his own ears than it should have. Forks clinked against plates. Someone laughed at a joke from a back booth. The jukebox crackled faintly. But for him, the world had narrowed to Emily and the man leaning across the counter. Emily's eyes met his as he approached. For a heartbeat, she seemed surprised, as though she hadn't expected anyone to break the invisible wall around her. Then a flicker of relief softened her face, the rigid tension in her shoulders dipping ever so slightly. Mark offered her a smile that was deliberately warm, almost casual, the kind of smile you'd give an old friend you hadn't seen in years. "Hey, Emily," he said, his voice steady calm. Her lips parted, confusion and gratitude mixing in her expression. He'd used her name, lifted straight from the tag on her apron, but the familiarity in his tone made it feel like more. The man at the counter turned, his eyes narrowing. His hand curled around his mug, the ceramic scraping against the counter's surface as he shifted. "You know her?" His tone wasn't friendly. Mark kept his posture relaxed, but his voice carried quiet authority. "She's busy working. Why don't you give her some space?" The words weren't loud, but they carried. A small hush fell over the diner, forks pausing midair, conversation stalling for just a second. It wasn't the volume of his voice that drew attention. It was the firmness behind it, the refusal to bend. The man's jaw tightened. "I was just talking." Mark didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice or lean forward. He stood there, calm, immovable. "She doesn't look like she wants to talk." For a moment, tension coiled between them, thick enough that Emily stopped breathing. Mark's heart pounded hard, but he refused to let it show. He'd learned long ago that sometimes strength wasn't about swinging fists. It was about holding steady when someone tried to push. The man muttered something under his breath, a grumble too low to catch, but his eyes cut sharp at Mark before he shoved his mug aside. He slapped a few bills on the counter, the gesture more about irritation than generosity, and pushed himself off the stool. The bell over the diner door jingled harshly as he left, the sound carrying finality. Emily let out a slow, shaky breath, as though she had been holding it for minutes. She gripped the counter for support, her knuckles pale from the tension. For the first time all morning, her smile faltered completely. No mask, no performance, just exhaustion and fragile relief. "Thank you," she said softly. Her voice trembled, but not from fear now. "No one's ever stepped in before. I thought I just had to deal with it." Mark shook his head, his tone even but firm, the way you'd state something obvious. "No one should have to deal with that. Not ever." She blinked, her eyes glistening, and gave him the smallest nod of acknowledgement. Across the diner, Sophie sat in the booth, wide-eyed but smiling faintly, as if she had just watched her dad become exactly what she believed he was, someone who didn't look away. The moment the door closed behind the man, the diner seemed to exhale. Conversations resumed in low murmurs. The clink of cutlery against plates returned, and the jukebox hummed faintly again. But for Emily, the world didn't immediately snap back into place. She stood still for a moment, one hand braced against the counter, as though giving herself permission to breathe. Mark stayed nearby, not looming, not crowding her, just present. His expression carried no trace of triumph or bravado, only steady reassurance. Emily glanced at him, her lips parting as though searching for the right words. When they came, they were barely louder than the hum of the diner. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice tremulous. "No one's ever stepped in before. I thought I just had to deal with it." Mark shook his head gently. "No one should have to deal with that. Not ever." His tone was calm, even, the way you'd point out something obvious, like the sky being blue. Something in her posture shifted at that, shoulders dropping, her stance softening. The mask she'd worn all morning cracked, replaced by raw relief. From across the room, Sophie had been watching everything. She slid out of the booth and waved Emily over, her little hand beckoning insistently. Emily hesitated for a moment, then walked toward her, curiosity pulling her steps forward. Sophie tore the last pancake on her plate in half, syrup glistening on the uneven edges. She set one piece carefully on a napkin and pushed it toward Emily. "You can have some," she said, her voice earnest and innocent. Emily blinked, caught off guard. For a second, she didn't move, then a quiet chuckle escaped her lips. This time, the laugh was real, soft, warm, carrying none of the brittle edge from earlier. She crouched slightly to Sophie's level and accepted the offering as though it were more than just food. "Thank you, sweetheart," she said gently, her voice fuller now, touched with something almost like gratitude too big for words. Mark watched the exchange from a step away, his chest tightening with quiet pride. He had stepped in when it mattered, but it was Sophie's small, unguarded gesture that closed the circle. Where his presence had created safety, Sophie's kindness had filled it with warmth. Emily straightened, still holding the scrap of pancake in her hand, as though reluctant to eat it too quickly. She looked at Mark once more, her eyes clearer now, less clouded by tension. For the first time that morning, her smile reached all the way to her eyes. And in that moment, Mark understood the heart of it all. Kindness wasn't always loud or complicated. Sometimes it was as small as making someone feel safe enough to smile again. A few weeks passed before Mark and Sophie found themselves back at the diner. The Saturday morning light streamed through the same wide windows, spilling across the familiar checkered floor. The air smelled of sizzling bacon and freshly brewed coffee, and for Mark, walking into the place felt almost like stepping back into a memory. Only this time, there was no tension tugging at him, no unease shadowing the booths. He and Sophie slid into the same red vinyl booth by the window. Sophie immediately pressed her hands to the glass, fogging a small circle with her breath before giggling at the imprint. Mark shook his head with a soft smile. It was comforting, these small rituals, their breakfasts, their shared routines, the moments that stitched their life together. Emily spotted them quickly. She was carrying a tray, but when her eyes landed on them, her smile came instantly. And this time, it was different. It wasn't the practiced cheer of a waitress working through another long shift. It was real, effortless, a warmth that reached her eyes without hesitation. "Good to see you two again," she said as she approached, setting menus on the table. Her voice carried none of the strain Mark had heard before. Instead, it was even, open, almost light. She poured his coffee and set down Sophie's chocolate milk, sliding it across the table with a steady hand. Mark nodded back, returning her smile. Sophie lifted her glass immediately, taking a long sip, a faint chocolate mustache forming on her upper lip. As Emily adjusted her apron, she leaned in slightly, her voice dropping just enough to carry weight. "I wanted to tell you," she began, her tone quiet but firm. "What you did that day, it meant more than you know." Mark looked at her, saying nothing yet, letting her continue. "I told my manager about some of the things that have happened," she said, her fingers brushing the edge of the tray she carried. "They're making changes. Real changes. I don't think I would have spoken up if you hadn't reminded me I matter." Her voice wavered for a heartbeat, but then she straightened, offering a small smile that carried both gratitude and strength. Mark felt something swell in his chest. Not pride in himself, he wasn't thinking of it that way. What filled him was something quieter, deeper, relief that someone else was better off because he hadn't stayed silent. And beyond that, a quiet pride in Sophie, because she had seen it all. She had seen how kindness wasn't just words but action, how courage could be steady and quiet, not loud. When they finished breakfast and headed for the door, Sophie slipped her small hand into his. She looked up at him, her expression thoughtful, her voice soft. "Daddy," she said, "I think you made her braver." Mark looked down at her, his chest tightening at the simplicity of her observation. He gave her hand a squeeze. "Maybe," he said with a gentle smile. "But you helped too." Together they stepped out into the morning air, the door closing softly behind them, the world outside feeling just a little bit kinder than it had before.